October 14th, 2021, 0317 a.m. The servers went cold, not just offline, not a power surge, but absolute, immediate digital silence across 3 continents. The global security apparatus, the ones who had been tracking every keystroke, every illicit transaction of the syndicate known only as Chimera, blinked, and they were gone. How does an empire built on trillions of stolen dollars, woven into the fabric of the digital world, simply vanish into the ether? Then, the truly chilling part, buried deep within the final, fragmented logs, investigators found a single, unencrypted message, a taunt addressed not to any government, but to the darkness itself. "The lights are out. Did you even notice we were playing?" It was the most audacious, most sophisticated vanishing act in the history of organized digital crime. For 2 years, Chimera had been the phantom limb of the dark web, a decentralized cartel that didn't traffic in drugs or guns, but in pure, untraceable information and liquidity. They hijacked national power grids for microsecond leverage, laundered cryptocurrency through shell corporations faster than any human mind could follow, and held the secrets of Fortune 500 CEOs hostage with the detached professionalism of a highly paid accountant. Now, nothing. Just the echoing hum of empty bandwidth. The immediate response was panic disguised as procedure. Intelligence analysts around the world scrambled, their screens showing a ghost town where milliseconds before, a vibrant, toxic ecosystem had thrived. They were looking for a breach, a raid, a catastrophic hardware failure. They found nothing that made sense. The infrastructure hadn't been destroyed, it had been surgically, perfectly vacated. Imagine an entire city's population, all 7 million inhabitants, standing up from their desks, leaving their coffee steaming, and walking out the front door at the exact same instant, leaving the keys in the lock. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a statement of absolute, untouchable control. To understand the scope of the void they left behind, you have to rewind, back to the moment the hunt intensified, to the flickering green glow of a basement office in Tallinn, 6 months before the silence. That's where we find the relentless pursuer, the person who had spent 18 months mapping the labyrinthine routes of Chimera, a cybersecurity specialist known within the shadowy circles only by the handle Oracle. Oracle didn't have a badge, a government affiliation, or even a real name they were willing to share with the FBI task force tracking them. They were a ghost hunting ghosts, driven by an almost pathological need to impose order on digital chaos. Oracle's workstation was a fortress of custom code and physical cooling units, humming a constant, low-frequency song of effort. They didn't use off-the-shelf spyware. They built bespoke digital probes, tiny, self-deleting lines of logic designed to mimic standard network traffic, flowing unnoticed through the arteries of the cartel's operations. The goal wasn't to shut them down, that was impossible, but to map the hierarchy, to find the nexus point, the single thread that held the whole terrifying tapestry together. The early days were a frustrating blizzard of noise. Chimera operated in cells, small, self-contained units sharing only encrypted transaction hashes with other cells. If one cell was compromised, the others wouldn't even know the language of the compromised data. Oracle realized early on that the cartel didn't use a single central server. They utilized a distributed ledger, far more complex and agile than anything publicly known, a constantly shifting membrane of digital identities. The keyboard clicks in that basement felt less like typing and more like striking stone, trying to find the right frequency. Then came the breakthrough, a minuscule slip in protocol during a massive European bond manipulation scheme. A fraction of a second too long on a transaction confirmation delay. For anyone else, it was a rounding error. For Oracle, it was a ripple in the water that suggested depth. They focused every probe on that specific temporal signature. The next few weeks were a blur of caffeine and escalating tension. Oracle started seeing patterns emerge from the static, recognizing the fingerprints of specific encryption algorithms used only by a handful of former Russian military cryptographers. These weren't common criminals, these were architects of digital warfare, now applying their trade to profit. The stakes escalated from financial theft to national security threat almost overnight. The air in that small room seemed to thicken with the implied threat. Chapter 2: The Canary Trap. Oracle understood that direct confrontation was suicide. If Chimera sensed a genuine threat, they wouldn't fight. They would initiate a scorched earth protocol, wiping their presence and likely retaliating against the tracking apparatus. The plan required bait, something impossibly valuable that Chimera couldn't resist, yet fragile enough to lead them into a controlled environment. The bait was constructed, a fictitious, high-yield investment portfolio, supposedly held in a near untraceable offshore bank, containing billions in legacy cryptocurrency that had been dormant since the early days of Bitcoin, the digital equivalent of buried treasure. Oracle seeded this lure across dark web forums known to be monitored by Chimera's acquisition specialists. It was an invitation written in the language of greed. The wait was agonizing. Every digital ping, every unusual spike in network activity, sent a jolt through the system. The faint, background sound of the cooling fan seemed to mock the silence of the response. Then, a whisper. A single, encrypted query referencing the specific, obscure digital ledger Oracle had fabricated for the bait. They had taken the hook. The next phase was a tightrope walk. Oracle didn't try to track the source of the query, that would be too slow. Instead, they mapped the path the query took. It bounced, not across standard VPNs, but through compromised IoT devices. Smart thermostats in Tokyo, hospital imaging systems in Berlin, traffic control sensors in Sao Paulo. Chimera was using the world's passive infrastructure as their own invisible transit network. The complexity was breathtaking. It was like trying to follow a scent through a hurricane. The path led, tentatively, toward a set of servers hidden within a seemingly legitimate global logistics company based out of Singapore. The digital doors were heavily barred, layers upon layers of adaptive firewalls that learned and countered every probe Oracle sent. It felt like throwing pebbles at a mountain range. The pressure became immense. Oracle knew that if they spent too long probing this location, the mountain would notice the disturbance. The critical piece of information arrived not through brute force, but through exhaustion. One of the decoy probes Oracle had deployed, designed to mimic low-level network maintenance chatter, was accidentally left running for just a few seconds too long. It caught an automated handshake between two server clusters within the Singapore hub. It wasn't encrypted data, it was a timestamp synchronization packet. A tiny, almost meaningless piece of metadata that proved, unequivocally, that two distinct operational wings of Chimera were communicating directly, using a proprietary, time-sensitive protocol. This was the nexus Oracle had been searching for, the central nervous system. Chapter 3. The Fracture Point. Oracle now had the location of the heart, but the clock was ticking down to October 14th. The cartel was demonstrably preparing for something major, signaled by a sudden coordinated reduction in all peripheral activity, the digital equivalent of a predator holding its breath before the final pounce. The strategy shifted from surveillance to sabotage, but sabotage without destruction. Oracle couldn't risk a conventional shutdown that would trigger alarms. They needed internal collapse. The synchronization packet provided the vulnerability. The cartel relied on absolute precise timing to manage their distributed ledger and move trillions in assets without detection. The plan involved injecting a single, perfectly crafted piece of digital noise into that synchronization stream. Not data, not malware, but a subtle systemic delay. A ghost in the machine that would cause the cartel's own internal systems to register critical transaction failures across their network. If the timing was off by just 50 milliseconds across 5 separate global checkpoints, the entire distributed ledger would flag massive, irreconcilable conflicts. The infiltration itself was brutal. It required bypassing the Singapore defenses not by hacking them, but by exploiting a vulnerability in the underlying virtualization software they were running. A zero-day exploit Oracle had been hoarding for years, waiting for the perfect target. The sounds associated with this infiltration were less like typing now, and more like a frantic, high-speed data torrent being forced through a narrow pipe. As the first packets of the time delay code were injected, the immediate feedback was terrifying. Alarms began flashing internally across the digital landscape Oracle was monitoring. But they weren't alerts directed outward. They were internal conflict warnings within Chimera's own system. The cartel was fighting itself. Then, the system began to cannibalize its own operations. Units started freezing assets belonging to other units, believing they were being attacked by external forces. The order, the rigid structure that made Chimera so effective, dissolved into digital anarchy. The silence Oracle had been seeking was achieved not through deletion, but through enforced systemic distrust. This internal chaos provided the necessary window. While the cartel was busy fighting phantom enemies within its own ranks, Oracle executed the final sequence, not to steal, but to render the entire operational framework inert, delinking every known wallet, dissolving every shell corporation, turning trillions into untraceable, useless strings of code. It was the ultimate denial of service attack, aimed internally. The digital smoke cleared just as the clock ticked toward 03:17 a.m. on October 14th. The entire operational footprint, the digital infrastructure that had spanned servers across the globe, simply stopped transmitting coherent data.
The energy wasn't cut. The purpose was removed. The lights, figuratively speaking, went out because the machine they powered suddenly had no instructions.
And that brings us back to the unsettling final message found in the fragments. The lights are out. Did you even notice we were playing? The central mystery remains. Why abandon the Empire? Oracle, the ghost hunter, never found a body, never identified a single face. The experts later theorized that the cartel's leaders, the architects, realized their infrastructure was compromised beyond repair. Not by a government raid, but by an unforeseen, elegant saboteur. They hadn't been caught. They had chosen to vaporize their own creation rather than let it fall into adversarial hands. They walked away from trillions, leaving behind only the ghost of their competence. The chilling truth, the one that keeps security agencies awake, is that Chimera didn't disappear because they were defeated. They disappeared because they decided the game was over, and they had the power to declare the end on their own terms. And somewhere, in the vast unmapped spaces of the digital world, the architects of that vanishing act are waiting for the next game to begin, perhaps noticing now, in the silence, that someone actually saw them play.